It is so great to be here with you tonight. I actually performed at Joe's Pub late 90s, so just a couple of years ago. And, you know, some of the same themes that I was working on back then are still coming up now. So I am Ava Chin. I am a fifth generation Chinese American New Yorker. How many of us have you ever met, right? And I've been collecting our stories since childhood, largely because I grew up estranged from my dad, who was, by all accounts, a man so handsome, so privileged, that he was essentially the Prince of Chinatown. So recently, I was interviewing a former Chinatown resident, and he told me this story. When this man was a teenager in the 1970s, he was hanging out, and after a night of carousing with his friends, they found themselves outside of Chinatown's oldest building. And it's actually not just Chinatown's oldest row house, it's actually the oldest row house in all of Manhattan. And they heard something. Gong gong, gong gong, gong gong. Gong, 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 gong. The building had a heartbeat. Now, anybody else would have said, oh, come on, quit kidding me. How can a building have a heartbeat? But something about this story resonated with me. And so I texted him. Were you kidding me when you said that you heard a heartbeat coming from out of that building? No, I heard it. And did you ever hear it again? No. So this building is special to me too, because it's the site of my greatest transformation. It's the place where I went from being a young woman who had never met her father to the writer that you see standing before you today. And it all started with my Chin grandfather. Gong gong, 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 gong gong. Gong gong is the Cantonese term for grandfather, and it's what my father's family called him. This Gong Gong was also a writer, and when I was growing up in Flushing, Queens, writing stories about reuniting with my long-lost father, Gong Gong was a borough away living on Mott Street, telling our stories to whomever would listen. I was a sophomore in college when we found out that he passed, and we found out in the newspapers. This obituary led me on a path towards finally confronting all of the mysteries of the past. Gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong. Gong gong, gong gong, gong gong. 27 years ago, I was standing in front of that building, the building with a heartbeat. Right next to me on the buzzer was my father's name on it. I was about to do the most terrifying and difficult thing of my life. I was about to meet him. I pushed the buzzer. And as I stood there, looking through the glass windows flanking the front door, I knew that all of a sudden his footsteps were coming down, and I saw my father as a pair of feet running down the carpeted staircase. And when he opened up the door and looked at me as awkwardly as I felt, I knew my life was about to change. Now, I grew up in a family that could see ghosts as clearly as the person sitting next to you. But the specter of my father walking out was by far the biggest haunting. And now here he was in front of me, the man of the hour, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. Gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong, gong gong. That night, we walked through the streets of Chinatown, and my father began pointing out all of the notable places of interest. You see that store over there? That's where we ran Chinatown's first coffee shop. Do you see that basement down over there? When I was a kid, that was an opium den. And then he pointed straight ahead at a 6-story red brick residential apartment building that seemed to encompass the entire neighborhood. You see that window over there? That's where Gong Gong and your great-grandparents lived. And you see that window over there? In that apartment, that's where Gong Gong Papa lived. That's where I was born. I stood there, slack-jawed and astonished. I must have passed this building hundreds of times before and never knew that the family I was most yearning to meet was there the entire time. Suddenly, a man walked by, and he said, in a Lower East Side accent, "Hello, Stanley." My father ignored him, preferring to stare only at me. He really is the Prince of Chinatown, I thought. My father and I would only have a single golden year of getting to know each other before he reverted back to his now you see me, now you don't Houdini-like ways. He would only ever be a ghostly presence in my life. But Gong Gong was the invisible hand dropping breadcrumbs to the story. Now, we never met, but Chinese people believe that the border between us and the dead is porous. And I would soon learn that just like me, Gong Gong grew up not knowing his father. But this was because the American immigration restrictions, the Chinese Exclusion Act laws, made it so difficult for Chinese fathers working in America to go back home to visit their families, because they never knew if they would be able to get back into America. Unlike other nationalities who could bring in their families for the price of a ship ticket, we had to hire lawyers and provide white witnesses to vouch for us. So just like me, Gong Gong grew up yearning for his father. But luckily for him, when he was 7 years old, his father came back and reunited the family. Gong Gong was in grade school when he arrived in New York. And from World War I to the Great Depression, he watched the neighborhood change from site of refuge for Chinese fleeing the anti-Chinese sentiment out west, this violence that created the Chinese Exclusion Act in the first place, to thriving neighborhood where the first Chinese American families were attempting to lay down roots. Gong Gong joined the first Chinatown Boy Scouts troop. And then, when he grew up, he worked in the family restaurants and stores, including a fancy supper club in Times Square, complete with its own orchestra. As maitre d', Gong Gong pomaded his hair and danced the quick step with white women during the Roaring '20s. As a family man, he became the neighborhood basketball coach, and he coached the local team straight to the Police Athletic League championships, and they won. Gong Gong turned our store into the Sugar Bowl, Chinatown's first coffee shop, and it was at the Sugar Bowl where Gong Gong later had a side gig as the neighborhood bookie, a gig so lucrative that the family was able to afford a huge summer home out on the Jersey Shore. Gong Gong encouraged my father, his son, to become one of Chinatown's first lawyers and to become politically active, things which Gong Gong couldn't do himself because of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws. He knew better than anyone else that our stories spoke to something much larger about the community, about the Chinese diaspora, about what it means to be Chinese in America. Before he died, Gong Gong left behind an oral history at the Chinatown History Project, an ancestor story with a writer friend of his, and the outlines of a book about his relationship with his father, who was the head of the On Long Tong, which when I was growing up, the media referred to as the Chinese mafia. These nuggets of information piqued my interest, so it set me on a journey to trying to understand what was fact from what was fiction. I ended up interviewing family members, extended family members, folks who had lived in our buildings, folks who had lived in Chinatown. I even gathered the Chinese Exclusion Act files on all of the family members that existed. I won a Fulbright and brought my entire family back to China in order to visit the villages that Gong Gong and the others left behind. It would take me 25 years before I could get my hands on his oral history. And when I did, I listened to 2 years' worth of interviews, listening as Gong Gong's robust voice grew weaker and weaker with every interview. I listened until the last interview, conducted only a couple of weeks before he passed. I listened until the only thing left was the final click and the refrigerator hum of the audio tape. I couldn't know that all of those years pining away from my father, that it was actually Gong Gong who was the missing piece to the puzzle. And when I think back all of those years standing in front of that building, the building with a heartbeat, I think about the things that I most wanted: to be reunited with my father and to understand my family. But what is this strange thing called family anyway? A father that rarely materializes? A Gong Gong who leads you to the story? A resounding heartbeat that echoes throughout an entire community? Recently, an interviewer asked me, "Did you ever forgive your father for walking out?" I just shrugged. Forgiveness is an act in progress. Besides, I asked her, does anybody ever really get the relationship with their parents that they most yearned for as a child? But perhaps through all of these years of piecing together this story, I learned something even more important. You don't always get what you most yearned for, but sometimes, if you're very quiet and you listen for it, you get something even better. Gong Gong, Gong Gong, Gong Gong. Say it with me. Gong Gong, Gong Gong, Gong Gong. Gong Gong, Gong Gong, Gong Gong. Gong Gong, Gong Gong.